Hey, welcome back to the Prayer for Healing podcast. My name is Clark Varon. Today we are in the Book of Genesis. We're continuing our series in Genesis. In the previous episode, we talked about how Jacob and Esau were feuding, and then Jacob gets sent off to Mesopotamia, which is the hometown of Rebekah, Isaac's wife, his mother, right? Says, hey, go live with my brother Laban. And up there, you can hopefully find a wife, and you can start your family. You can get away from brother Esau. Today, we are going to be continuing that story. And what's crazy is that all the deception that happens in Jacob's life around Esau that we saw in the previous episode continues on into this episode, and he ends up having this big family feud even with his brother-in-law. If you haven't seen the previous episode, then I highly suggest you go there. Or if you're just jumping in right here, you can start from the beginning of this series. The links to the intro to this series are in the description below and the previous episode as well. But for now, let's dive in. You are listening to the Prayer for Healing podcast, and we invite you to join our online community. We have live Bible studies, prayer sessions, a prayer army community group, guided prayer meditations, courses on deliverance, and one-on-one counseling. Find all the information that you need at prayerforhealing.co. So previously, we learned how Esau and Jacob had this brotherly feud, right? And Rebekah actually assisted Jacob in some of that feuding, like getting the patriarchal blessing from Isaac instead of Esau getting it, when even Esau was technically the older brother, even though that they were twins. And so what ends up happening is Rebekah basically tells Jacob, he's like, you should get out of here. You should go find a wife in my hometown. They were currently living in the land of Canaan, right? And Esau had married some Hittites. Now, Hittites are, think of it as like a tribe within Canaan, or kind of like a state within Canaan. And Rebekah said to Isaac, he's like, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, like Esau, one of the women of this land, what good will my life be to me? She basically was like, I hate Esau's wives so much. They're so miserable. If my other son also ends up marrying the same type of women, I'm just going to X myself. You know, it's like life is not going to be worth living anymore. And so she sends Jacob off to Mesopotamia to find A, a wife, and B, to escape from Esau's fury, because Esau wants to kill Jacob. In fact, Rebekah kind of like saw this. It's like, wow, Jacob, dude, your brother's kind of totally pissed about this whole paternal blessing thing. You should get out of here. So what ends up happening? Well, Jacob ends up going to Mesopotamia. Basically, remember when Abraham, when he escaped from the land of the Chaldeans, he went north first up the Mesopotamian rivers. So this northern part of the Mesopotamian rivers is where Jacob is now going to find his wife. And en route, Jacob actually has a dream. And it's a reaffirmation of the promise that God made with Abraham. It says, basically what Jacob saw was he saw a ladder up to heaven. And then, this is a quote from the Bible, the Lord stood above the ladder and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So remember, God made this promise with Abraham. Hey, this is going to be your land. And he told Abraham, if you follow everything that I command you, then the entire world will be blessed through you and your descendants. God reaffirms that promise now with Jacob, saying, hey, all of that stuff that I promised Abraham is true, right? So at this point, Jacob begins to accept God. But it's also very revealing how far he actually had strayed from the true God while living in the land of the Canaanites. So Jacob says, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear on this big long journey up to Mesopotamia, he's worried about his safety and being able to find food and all that stuff, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. It's like, if you do all these things and I come back to my hometown in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. So he ends up actually setting up a pile of stones and puts a pillar in the middle of it, which is actually Canaanite culture. Remember, Jewish culture, what Abraham was doing is he was making altars, which is different, but these pillars actually, they're a big reminder of the devil worship Baal, right? So he's like, I don't really know who God is, but if I'm taken care of, then I'm going to trust that you're God. And then he also says, and all that you give me, I will give you a full tenth to you. And so you can see here that he makes this conditional promise to follow God. He's like, God, if you take care of me, then I will believe in you. And in addition to believing in you, I will give to you, right? But he's like not even sure how to worship God. He's like, at this point, he's really confused in his faith, setting up pillars instead of altars and all of this stuff. And it's really revealing how corrupt the faith really was at this time, and how the traditions, the Jewish traditions, have not been well established into Jacob's life yet. He still needs to be groomed by God. And then after Jacob begins to accept God, Jacob finally makes it up to Mesopotamia, which is, remember, the homeland of Rebekah. You remember how Isaac had to leave his homeland. Isaac, the son of Abraham, was sent north to find the wife Rebekah, and then he came back down to the promised land. Well, same thing's happening now with Jacob. Jacob sent north, and he's now going to meet Rachel. And then they will end up also coming back to the promised land that God has promised them, right? It's currently the land of Canaan, but eventually it will become Israel. And so what ends up happening is Jacob is actually hanging out near a well, kind of asking around. He's like, hey, does anyone know who this guy named Laban is? He's like technically my uncle, and I'm kind of looking for a wife up in here. And so he's hanging out by this well. And then one guy says, oh, yeah, that's Rachel right there with all of Laban's sheep, right? And so Rachel is a shepherdess, and she comes over to the well. And what ends up happening is Jacob sees Rachel, and it's like love at first sight. What ends up happening is, it says, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother, right? So his mother's brother, his uncle. So Laban is his uncle. Rachel is technically his cousin, right? And then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. So immediately he sees Rachel with all these flocks. He takes water out of the well to water all of the flocks that Rachel's shepherding. And then he kisses her, weeps aloud. And then Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. So Rachel's probably like, okay, I appreciate all of the kindness and all the generosity. Who are you again? So he explains himself. He's like, dude, we're cousins, right? And so Jacob then goes to Laban, his uncle, and is like, hey, I love your daughter, love at first sight, right? I will do anything for your uncle. He actually promises to serve Laban for 7 years in exchange to marry Rachel. That's how badly he wants to marry this girl. And so it says Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. He served for 7 years, but it didn't matter because he loved this girl so much. He's just happy he got to be with her, right? That's so beautiful. What a great story. But things are about to get ugly quick. Watch this. So Laban ends up deceiving Jacob on the day that Jacob is supposed to be allowed to sleep with Rachel. Instead, Laban, his uncle, actually slips in his older daughter, Leah. He had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. He slips in Leah, his older daughter, and basically is like, hey, I want to get this girl married first before I get Rachel married. So Jacob, you're just going to have to, he ends up tricking him into marrying both of his daughters. So Jacob, this is how it's told in the Bible, Genesis chapter 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. But in the evening, he, Laban, the uncle, right, took his daughter Leah instead of Rachel and brought her to Jacob. And he went into her. So Jacob, in the middle of the night that can't see anything, he thinks that his uncle is bringing in Rachel, right? He ends up bringing in Leah instead. And in the morning, behold, He's surprised, right? He's like, behold, it was Leah. He's like, I just slept with the wrong person. I didn't want to sleep with Leah. I wanted Rachel. And so Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me, right? And so Jacob is like, what is this? And he ends up serving another 7 years to Laban in exchange for Rachel. But thankfully, Laban's really courteous. He's like, okay, you promised to serve me 7 years. I'll give you Rachel right now. You do your 7 years afterwards, right? And so Laban replies, we will give you the other. We will give you Rachel as well. Also in return for serving me another 7 years. So now he's serving 14 years for his wife. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. But here's the thing. Jacob now has two wives. He's got Leah and he's got Rachel. And he never really wanted to be with Leah in the first place. And so the Bible actually says that he kind of hated Leah, right? But he really loved Rachel. And so God ends up blessing Leah more than Rachel, to basically bless Leah and be like, hey, you are loved by me. You are loved by God. So what ends up happening? Well, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. He opens Leah's womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah goes on to have 3 sons. So each time, she hopes that Jacob is going to end up loving her. She's like, thankfully, I have my first son. Maybe then my husband will love me. My second son. So by the 3rd time, Leah says, now this time, my husband will be attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. So after this, the Bible cuts back to Rachel. It's basically like Rachel at this point, Rachel is envious of Leah. Rachel is envious of her sister and actually takes out that anger on Jacob. And it says here in the Bible, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Rachel is at this point so envious. She wants to die. She's like, I want children, otherwise I will die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? He's like, I am not God. I cannot give you children. I can do the sleeping with you part, but I can't give you kids. You know, that's up to God to be able to give you kids. And so what does Rachel do? Rachel says, basically, if I can't have kids, then I will give you my servant. So she had a maid servant, a female servant, that she ends up giving to Jacob. And she's like, Jacob, sleep with my maid servant. Now, this is something that was common practice. We saw this with Abraham, right? Abraham's wife, Sarah, could not bear any children. So Sarah gave Abraham her maid servant, Hagar, the Egyptian woman, right? And he ended up having his kid Ishmael, right? So we've seen this pattern happen before. And so this is more common practice back then than we would probably think. And so the servant now ends up having kids basically on behalf of Rachel. So at this point, it says she gave him her servant. So Rachel gave Jacob her servant, Bilhah, as a wife. And Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore a son. And then Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son, right? So at this point, we're starting to see, okay, Jacob is now sleeping with 2 wives. He's got now a 3rd wife, who's actually a slave wife type of concubine thing. I don't really know the relationship basis there. But we do know that according to Sarah and Abraham's relationship, like that first marriage is kind of more important than the other ones. And it gets complicated when you get 3 wives and all this stuff. And so it's kind of wild what ends up happening. At this point, the sisters, Leah and Rachel, they start to feud with each other. Basically, who can have more kids? Because they're feuding who can be loved more by Jacob, right? Leah has always felt like this inferior person because he knows that he loves Rachel more. And so they end up feuding. Basically, whoever can have more kids is going to win Jacob's love. That's basically the basis of this whole argument. And so when Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. So now we start to see that Jacob he's birthing children to both his wives and both of their servants. And he ends up having a lot of children with 4 different women. And so this is a pretty wild part of the story because they're really starting to fight with each other over who can have more kids. And the good thing is that these kids, God actually had a plan for all of this, because these kids, he's going to end up having 12 sons, and these 12 sons are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Now, Leah and Rachel at a time were barren. They weren't having any kids, end up getting pregnant again. First, Leah gets pregnant with a fifth and a sixth son. And then it says, then God remembered Rachel. Now, Rachel hasn't had any of her own kids yet, right? It says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph. Now, if you remember from the 12 tribes of Israel, Joseph is actually the son that is the second youngest. There's one who's going to be younger, right? And his name is Benjamin. He's going to be the youngest of all of the children. But Joseph is the second youngest. He's the 11th son. And he's going to be the one who gets sold into slavery in Egypt, right? And him being sold into slavery is going to lead the entire family being basically following him to Egypt, because he's going to prepare the entire nation of Egypt for a famine that is coming. So his whole family is going to come to escape the famine. That's how the Jews get into Egypt, right? So this is how the story is starting to tie in all together. Jacob has all these kids. The 11th kid is Joseph, and Joseph plays a super important role in the stories to come, as we will see. So after this, Jacob is actually ready to go home. He basically is like, hey, I got my 11 kids. I got my 4 wives. I mean, who knows how many wives? At least 2, maybe 4 if you count the slave wives, And he's starting to gain some wealth, starting to gain some flocks. But before he leaves, he's like, I want to go home. And he tells Laban, his uncle, he's like, I want to go home, but I need some flocks of my own. I've been serving you as a slave this whole time. Can I please earn some of your flocks? And so as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my home country. And he tries to strike a deal with Laban for part of his flocks. Jacob tells Laban, hey, you had little before I came. You really didn't own that much. Your flocks were not that big. And it's increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you where I have turned. He's basically saying, I have worked hard in order to grow your sheep, and God has blessed you on my behalf, right? So Laban ends up agreeing to give Jacob all of the speckled and spotted sheep. So Jacob actually requests, he says, let me pass through all of your flocks today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. That will be my wages. So he's about to put in actually another 6 years of work of managing all of the flocks. And he's going to be able to keep all the speckled and spotted ones. It's going to distinctly show which ones are his and which ones are actually Laban's. But here's what ends up happening. Jacob actually starts to deceive his uncle. Now, we've already seen that Jacob is kind of like a master manipulator already in certain ways, which is pretty interesting because it shows how imperfect these patriarchal figures in our faith are, right? Because we've already seen how he deceived his brother Esau twice to the point where Esau wanted to just kill him. And now he's going to a different place in Mesopotamia. He's deceiving his uncle, and he's actually going to crossbreed all of the sheep in a specific way so that there's more speckled and spotted sheep and goats than there are other ones, right? So he is basically going to receive all the sheep, all the spotted and speckled animals, and the ones that are not speckled and spotted are going to continue to be Laban's. But they're not having any non-speckled and spotted ones because Jacob is manipulating the breeding cycle. So this manipulative breeding starts to actually anger Laban and his sons. They don't know that it's going on, but they're being angered because at this point, Jacob is becoming super rich off of Laban's flocks, right? So it says here in Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 through 2, it says, now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all this wealth. Basically, he's getting rich off of our dad, right? And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. So Jacob's starting to see, hey, my uncle does not like me anymore. His kids don't like me. My cousins are ticked at me. And so he actually plans an escape in the middle of the night with all of his flocks, his wives, and his children. Hey, if you've been enjoying this episode of the Prayer for Healing podcast, then please like, subscribe, and comment below so that our content continues to show up on your feed. And also, please remember that we are a fully self-funded podcast. I have poured every dollar that I have into this, and now it's up to you to keep the podcast going. Please throw a dollar back our way at prayerforhealing.co/give. And what ends up happening is basically 3 days after Jacob flees, Laban finds out that Jacob has now left. He's not coming back, right? So when it was told to Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days. And he eventually caught up with him, right? And at this point, Laban is furious. It says here that Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword?" Now, the daughters actually very much agreed to go with Jacob. They were definitely not captives of the sword, but Laban's mad, right? So he's kind of exaggerating everything right now. "Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre?" He's basically like, dude, I could have given you a nice going away party, right? Jacob doesn't buy it, as we're going to see here in a second. He's like, nah, you would have robbed me of all the rest that I had like you had been doing this whole time. "And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell?" Right? He's like, dude, I didn't even get to say goodbye to my daughters. Now that touche, man, like you got some good points there. You definitely want to be able to say goodbye to your daughters before they disappear for the rest of your life and you don't get to see them ever again, right? So this really, once again, demonstrates how imperfect these really righteous figures in the Bibles are. It's like even the people who we look up to, of these forefathers of Jewish tradition, these forefathers of Israel, they were not perfect. There was deception, there was lying, there was manipulation. I mean, all these different things that were going on that show how truly imperfect these people are, even though that they were super righteous and they loved and they obeyed God, right? Now, Jacob replies to this big rebuke of Laban, and he's like, dude, nothing what you're saying is really true. He's saying, these 20 years I've been in your house. I served you for 14 years for your 2 daughters. First of all, I didn't even want the first one. You tricked me with the first one. So I did another 7 years for Rachel, the one that I had originally earned with the first 7 years, right? So I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and then 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. He's like, you kept changing how much I was paid, right? And I bet you that it was not for the benefit, right? I bet you that he kept reducing the wages. And I bet you that he kept reducing the wages because he saw how rich Jacob was getting. So it sounds like Jacob actually had a really good reason to not trust Laban and to really good reason to actually leave in the middle of the night, right? And so if the God of my father, Jacob says, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely you would have sent me away empty-handed. He's like, there's no way you would have sent me away with mirth and lyre and songs and tambourine. He's like, you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and my labor of my hands and rebuked you last night, and that's why I left, right? So Jacob basically claims, he's like, dude, you would have robbed me. There's no way you would have sent me away with this big going away party that you claim that you would have done. And so what ends up happening is they end up making up, and Laban and Jacob, they make a covenant that they are going to lay down a pile of stones, and they put a pillar up in this pile of stones, and this marks a border. And they say, we are not going to cross this border to see each other again. He's like, this will be the separation from us, right? And then early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. And then Laban departed and returned back home. And Jacob then continues on his way, right? Now at this point, Jacob still has to face Esau, right? He's heading home to his homeland. He still has not faced his brother who 20 years ago wanted to kill him, right? And so Jacob's actually really terrified of Esau, and he ends up sending messengers ahead of him and his whole entourage, basically saying, warning them, hey guys, Jacob's coming. We need to tell Esau that Jacob's coming to kind of gauge his response and see how is he going to respond. Well, guess what? And the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you. And he is coming with 400 men with him. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He's like, dude, he's coming with a whole army. Like, he still wants to kill me. He still wants to get after me. So Jacob starts to prepare for war. He splits up his family and his flocks, and he splits everything that he owns and everything into 2 different camps. And he says, hey, if Esau kills one of these camps, at least half of these people are going to be able to get out of here. They'll be able to escape. And then Esau says, in addition to that, in addition to protecting ourselves just in case, I'm also going to prepare a massive gift. So what does he do? He prepares 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He's like, dude, I am going all out, throwing everything that I can at Esau. And he sends all of this stuff as an entourage to Esau. Be like, here's my gift. And then that night, actually, before Jacob meets Esau, he ends up wrestling. In the middle of the night, he ends up wrestling with God. And God ends up actually renaming him to Jacob. So it says in the Bible that night, Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day, literally all night until the sun came up. When the man saw that he had not prevailed against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him, right? Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with me and have prevailed. So Israel literally means to strive with God, right? So here this man is saying, you have striven with God and with me and have prevailed. And so here it says, Jacob exclaims, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. That's Genesis chapter 32:30. So Jacob believes this man that he wrestled with all night was God, and that by simply touching his hip, he was able to dislocate his hip. And then he heals him again to show him, I am God, and I have the power to hurt you and to heal you, and I am renaming you as Israel. And him being named Israel is where obviously the nation of Israel comes from, and his sons, his 12 sons, end up becoming the 12 tribes of Israel. This is where the whole story, it's not necessarily where it begins, but we're still at the beginning of this whole nation of Israel, right? Now, the next day, after this big wrestling match with God, Jacob actually goes out and meets Esau. And now he hides his children and he hides his wives and stuff like that. And he goes out in front and he goes to meet Esau to be like, yeah, how are you going to behave? But he sees Esau, and Esau starts to run out to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept. And at first Esau was like, dude, I don't need all your presents. I don't need all your gifts, right? Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. But then Jacob insists. He says, please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dwelt graciously with me and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. And that is the happy reunion of how Jacob fled from his brother Esau. He met his wives. He ends up gaining all this wealth. He has another family feud. He comes back to his brother Esau, and they lived happily ever after. Not really, though, because what we're going to learn about in the next episode is that not everything is quite as perfect as it might seem in the Promised Land. If you want to check out the next episode, click right here, and we'll see you there. Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Prayer for Healing podcast. We release a new episode every single day, and the best way for you to not miss an episode is by liking and commenting on our videos and subscribing to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to join our online community. In the description below, you'll find links to our Bible studies, our prayer sessions, our Prayer Army community group, the 15-day deliverance challenge, and one-on-one counseling if you need some more personalized support. And please do not forget that we are a fully self-funded platform. Without your financial support, we cannot survive. You can find everything that you need at prayerforhealing.co. I'll see you in the next episode.